Now, I suppose you may wonder why Jesus' genealogy. What edification could we possibly get from a list of Jesus' forefathers and a few foremothers? I think the answer lies in what we personally understand of our own family lines. Often we look at our families and find them to be a mixture of cherished tradition on the one hand and other histories we'd rather leave behind on the other. I strongly believe that no matter how far we have traversed from our origins, we always maintain some of the traits of our ancestors. In other words, if we can't blame our faults on our DNA, who can we blame them on? The gospel writers attempted to show how Jesus fulfilled the prophecies of the Messiah in the Hebrew Bible. There are two genealogies of Jesus in the New Testament, in Matthew and Luke. The two are strikingly different, disagreeing on many ancestors. But both agree Jesus is the heir of King David. That was crucial in anointing him the Messiah, the descendant of David. While Matthew began with Abraham as his starting point, Luke began all the way back to Adam. Besides this, Matthew is a much different genealogy in another way. It includes women, Gentile women at that, and it includes disreputable men within Israel's history. Why does Matthew include such people? What is he trying to tell us about Jesus and his family? A framework that is helpful here is from the late Reverend Doug Adams. Doug was a United Church of Christ scholar and for many years professor of Christianity and the arts at Pacific School of Religion, where I had my first year of seminary. He often spoke of parent and grandparent stories. Parent stories, as he told it, are those stories parents tell us about how obedient and studious they were growing up. Stories about how they walked 5 miles to school in 6 feet of snow every day. Stories that have been cleaned up more than a bit. Grandparents, however, tell different versions of these same stories. How, well, there was no snow because they lived in Texas. And stories that are more colorful, that leave in the rough edges. Stories that tell us the truth of how our parents really acted as children. The best biblical stories, those in which there is hope for us, are like grandparent stories. Adams wrote Jesus, Paul, and the Hebrew scriptures tell stories that include rough edges, unethical or ambiguous characters, unresolved or surprising endings, and so we laugh and we know that we and others may live through the rough times in our lives too. Biblical stories present monarchs, patriarchs, matriarchs, and disciples not as perfectly faithful and ethical persons who we could hope to emulate, but rather as persons who are often immoral, unfaithful, and thick-headed. Therefore, in spite of our failings, we too can hope to be disciples. Matthew's genealogy is one of those grandparent stories. Take King David, for example. David was Israel's greatest king, the man after God's own heart, who we assume wrote dozens of psalms of praise to God. But Matthew can't help but stick it to David, referring not to his greatness, but saying, David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah, by another man's wife. Matthew reminds us that the great King David seduced, or more likely just wielded his power over Bathsheba and later had her husband killed. Uriah, her husband, was a Hittite, not an Israelite, and therefore a Gentile. So Bathsheba was likely a Gentile as well. Remember, such ethnic mixing was looked down upon in that time and was sometimes blamed for the desperate fate of Israel in exile. David is a central part of Jesus' line. After all, it is what established him as the Messiah, as the new king of Israel at the very beginning of the gospel. But it is also the very same passage that establishes a mixed race line for Jesus. The other women in Jesus' genealogy, including Mary, were not likely candidates to be included in any royal genealogical line, let alone the Messiah's. We have first Tamar, who pretended to be a prostitute and had intercourse with her father-in-law in order to bear a son after her first husband died. Biblical family values. And then there's Rahab, who was a prostitute in actuality, who nobly hid Israelite spies in the city of Jericho while it was being attacked and saved them. Both of these women were Canaanites, sometime enemies of the Israelites. And again, they were Gentiles. And finally, we have Ruth, also a foreigner, who seduced Boaz on the threshing floor. These women were treated as mere objects by men. They were pieces of property, nothing more. And yet they find their way into the line leading to Jesus. At a time when most women were not significant enough to be named in the Bible, breaking through one small part of the patriarchy. It is important not to forget that these women are aliens, so-called illegal immigrants. They were sojourners, not fully welcomed into a strange land, though the biblical mandate commanded otherwise. This genealogy is about all we know of Joseph and Mary. Much else is church legend that followed hundreds of years later. What little else we know of them is not impressive. Joseph was a carpenter, an artisan, little above a peasant laborer. Joseph just disappears in the Bible after Jesus is 12. His death doesn't even merit a mention. We assume that he has died by the time Jesus began his ministry, but we don't even know that for sure. Mary was a young girl, a teenage mother. At that time, it may not have been early for her to have children. But today, what scurrilous looks would we give her? And they will provide no royal quarters for the baby Jesus, but will struggle to find a place to birth the child and will soon be on the run as refugees. We have the men, all the men. There's Abraham and Isaac, the fathers of Israel, known as holy and righteous men, though their lives were a bit spotty in reality when it came to being faithful. Numerous kings are mentioned, the majority of which, truth be told, were oppressors who cared little for the law of God and for protecting the poor. And the rest, well, they give us a collective hum. They are long forgotten. We have to wonder how they rated a mention from Matthew. So what does this all mean? Women are given a place in Jesus' family, which is a mixed one. There are the great names of the history of the Hebrew people, but also a good number of despots as well. Jesus' family isn't too different from our own. Many of us, if we go back far enough, we can trace distant relations to kings and queens, presidents and celebrities. But we've also got some fruits and nuts in our family tree, and sometimes a whole herd of black sheep grazing beneath it. For Gentiles to be included, it shows that Jesus ushers in a kingdom in which lines of race, ethnicity, class, and gender are erased, in which all are considered to be children of God. For women to be included, it prefaces how Jesus will welcome women into his inner circle, and it affirms that God blesses and gifts women to the point of entrusting the light of the world to a teenage mother. For the disreputable, dishonorable, and downright shady characters to be included, there is good news. Adam says the good news is that if out of the worst can come the best, there is hope for our children. A UCC advertisement asked, if Jesus welcomed lepers, prostitutes, and convicts, shouldn't we? Well, according to St. Matthew, he may not have had a choice. They were his family. If we claim Jesus, we claim his family. So our decision is made for us. We are called to welcome all, the royal kings, good and very bad, immigrants, prostitutes, and adulterers, and the faithful, and refugees searching for a room at the inn. This is our family. There's grace in all this, because if the one who we await, Emmanuel, God with us, comes from such a family, then perhaps the Thanksgiving dinners we just all had don't look so bad after all, but are rather a holy banquet of God's own family. To God be the glory. Amen.